Welcome to the first of the conversations that we're having here at the Schuman Centre on behalf of ECOINT, which is a European Research Council project on 20th century international economic thinking. And our conversations are with international economic thinkers. My name is Glenda Sluger. I'm Joint Professor of History, or International History and Capitalism here at the Schuman Centre and in the History Department at the European University Institute here in Florence. And I'm also the director of this project, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to welcome this afternoon Professor Carmen Reinhart, a name everybody knows, I think, but just to remind us that she's Senior Vice President and World Bank Group Economist. And she is the first name that I thought of when we came up with this concept of trying to bring important international economic thinkers here and talk about how they think and what they think about. And in this case, we're very grateful too to Professor Thorsten Beck, who's in the front row, who's the director of the Florence School of Banking and Finance, for helping us make this event happen. In fact, Professor Reinhart is here for one of their events on sovereign debt. And we're here to discover more about the extraordinary career of Professor Reinhart, which is in and of itself, absolutely interesting and the focus of our event. But from my perspective too, it's particularly important in the context of trying to understand the impact that economists have had on international organisations and the ways in which economic thinking has had an impact on those institutions and those institutions on the way we think about economics at a more global world scale. So the aim of the project is to map out the range of economic thinking that takes place in international institutions for the last 100 years or so. So Professor Reinhart is going to speak personally not to that history, but to the present.
And old, but not that old.
Yeah. But we do have interesting shared interests in the past, and we'll talk about that. And we want to capture the breadth of ambition, really, that's invested in these institutions, or has been for a long time. And part of that history, when we look back, is one that involves women to a greater extent than we might imagine, because of the way in which, and this is how we've come to understand it, women who have studied economics and wanted to practice it, for a long time found it difficult to get jobs in academia, and might still be the case, we can discuss that, and also in national bureaucracies. But they did find homes very often in international institutions, and that's very interesting historically. And of course now, women head many of the really crucial international economic institutions that are part of the international order landscape that we share. So, our project has been to find these women in the past, but also to come to understand their work and their importance in the present. And in that project, I'm assisted by Dr. Johanna Gautier, here to my left, who has been crucial in setting this up today and making sure that it turns into something that lasts in terms of a resource. So I hope you don't mind that we're recording, but it's going to eventually end up on websites and become part of, I hope, what many of us can turn to think about not just international institutions, but also how women build careers in economics, and of course understand Professor Reinhart herself. So I want to start then by finding out more about your journey and what kind of economic international thinker you are. So if we go back to your career, you are currently on leave from a position as Minus A. Kombanakis Professor of International Financial Systems at Harvard Kennedy School. And I noticed that it's for public service. And of course, that public service is your job at the World Bank. You were Senior Policy Advisor and Deputy Director at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. You've held positions as Chief Economist and Vice President at the investment bank Bear Stearns in the 1980s. You've served on the advisory panel of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. You've been a member of the Congressional Budget Office panel of economic advisors in the United States. You've written on a variety of topics in macroeconomics and international finance, and your work has helped to inform our understanding of financial crises in particular in both advanced economies and emerging markets. You have a best-selling book co-authored with Kenneth S. Rogoff called This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly. And I immediately think, oh, historical perspective, fantastic. The book has been translated to over 20 languages and won the Paul A. Samuelson Award. And on the basis of these publications and your scholarly citations, you're ranked among the top economists worldwide. You have testified before Congress and been listed among Bloomberg Market's most influential 50 in finance. You are on Foreign Policy's top 100 global thinkers and Thomson Reuters, the world's most influential scientific minds. In 2018, you were awarded the King Juan Carlos Prize in Economics and NABE's Adam Smith Award, among others. You've been named among Barron's 100 most influential women in US finance, but I'd probably say world finance now. So this is extraordinary. And, can you take us back, though, to the earliest parts of this journey, which is, you are turning up as a Cuban emigre in the US as a child, and, how did you come to be an economist? What do you think led you to that particular career?
Well, it wasn't always by design.
Right.
Try not to laugh, but when I was in high school, I was more leaning towards the arts, and fashion merchandising and fashion design was really what I thought I wanted to do. I didn't do due diligence on pursuing the fashion design, so I started courses on fashion merchandising, and I hated it. And then I took an economics course taught by a Marxist, and it was, principles of economics according to him, but it was quite fascinating. It was quite fascinating, and that led me to take another course that he offered on history of thought. And then by then I really was engaged in economics, and the one easy one, once it became clear that I really liked economics, the one easy one was it had to be international.
Why?
Because I'm Cuban, Latin America has always sort of played a cultural important role. So the international dimension, my grandparents were from Spain, and so once it became clear that I wanted to do economics as a career, it was very clear that international would be. And then, I went to Columbia University, and this is where I met my husband, who's classmate, Vincent Reinhart. When I went to the university, I thought I wanted to be a professor, an academic economist. And Columbia University at that time was really a tense, very combative place. And it was, that and being tired of being chronically poor led me to Wall Street. So I figured maybe I don't want to be an academic economist. Maybe what I really want to do is be a partner at a, financial firm.
How hard is it for you to imagine this or to think about this at the time? Were other, young women in the courses?
No. I mean, this is, I'm not exactly biblical, but close, And so, this is the early 1980s, and women in Wall Street were very scarce, let alone in brokerage firms. There were somewhat higher shares, say, on commercial banking, but in the brokerage firms and asset management, it was. But at any rate, this was my first, and I should say, I did this all fairly prematurely. I went to Wall Street without having finished my PhD. I had completed my coursework and, had passed my field exams and all of that. But as I said, I was really just keen on getting my financial house in order, and I started deluding myself into thinking that I could have a full-time job at a brokerage firm and actually do my dissertation, which of course did not work out.
Okay.
I did not, in the 4+ years that I was at Bear Stearns, I don't think I managed to read more than 3 journal articles.
And what did you want to do your dissertation on at the time?
Okay, so what I thought I would do my dissertation on when I left before joining was more kind of monetary economics, financial innovation. That morphed significantly during my stint in Wall Street. I started at Bear Stearns in March of '82, and in August of '82, Mexico defaulted. And after Mexico was a wave of, and that was, fascinating. I mean, this is also the time in which, people talk about the Fed. The Fed is tightening, big hike in rates. Oh my God, they raised them 25 basis points. Well, I mean, in the run-up to my joining Bear Stearns, Paul Volcker raised interest rates in the United States from October of '79 to March of 1980 by almost 600 basis points. Wow. Mm-hmm. So this was a very volatile, very fascinating period. So, and when you're young like that, it's really absorbing, like in the classroom, I had heard about bond finance, this is B dot on the board. And then my first task at Bear Stearns was actually to project Treasury issuance because the U.S. budget deficit, this is deep recession, so, was ballooning, and to do this in real time. So the learning curve was incredibly steep, but I'm not particularly digressing. What I started out to say is that all these events began to shape what I wanted to do with my dissertation, and importantly, it was a combination of sort of the very difference in north-south dynamics, meaning the advanced economies and the emerging markets, also the role that commodity prices had played, because during the 1970s we had like today, big oil shocks, and then towards the tail end of the '70s, with very tight monetary policy, commodity prices crashed, and so by the time, when I did go back to Columbia University, I did finish my dissertation in less than 9 months. Wow. Because, I really did have a clear idea of what I wanted to do.
But see, already I see a story that's really interesting, because there are all sorts of obstacles, I would have thought, in just the kind of achievement you're already describing. I mean, how difficult was it to get the job at Bear Stearns, or even to imagine yourself going there, or how many women were doing PhDs in economics at this stage? So,
at Columbia University, Columbia at the time had a policy that thankfully they have since discontinued, in which they tended to admit fairly large classes for graduate program in the first year, have fairly broad-based, generous offerings of financing for the first year, but then cut you off more likely than not, except for a few from second year onward. And so there were 42 students in my class, and there were 4 women out of the 42. By the second year, the class size had shrunken to 27, and it got smaller into the third year. It was for years the econ numbers were very, very low, sort of stuck somewhere in the 15% more or less range. In Wall Street, as I said, very different from Wall Street today, even though if you go to high risk, risk-taking firms, the hedge fund industry, it's still less women than the. But was it difficult? Actually, getting the job in Wall Street, it actually was straightforward. I went to a headhunter that specialized in the industry and had 3 plausible alternatives. So that worked out. I think starting as a more junior person was certainly less challenging than as a more senior person would have been. And so, I was enamored of that job. This is, goals change over time. I had thought, I had started my graduate program thinking I wanted to be a professor. Then when I was in Wall Street, I convinced myself I really wanted to be a partner at Bear Stearns and that, have a career in that industry. Then I realized that, the first 2 years were great, in terms of the learning curve. But then as time went by, I had to do much more client outreach, which, talking to the clients, giving, a lot of road shows. And that was less appealing. And that's when I decided I better go back and finish my dissertation. So after a little over 4 years, about 4.5 years, I went back to Columbia and finished the dissertation.
And so when did international organizations like the IMF or the World Bank come into your
life right after I finished my dissertation? Right. When I disappointed greatly my thesis advisors because they wanted me to pursue an academic career. But my thesis advisor was Bob Lindell, who has, I think the IMF has a very special, and indeed, Jacob Frenkel, who was a student of Bob Lindell, was running the research department. He was chief economist at the time. And so I had, reading in the press daily, really, about the unfolding debt crisis of the 80s and the role of the IMF and so on, really made me want to go to the IMF or the Fed. So or the World Bank. I was torn between those three, but with a strong leaning to the IMF. And so the IMF came into my life. When I finished a dissertation, I went into the IMF.
And so what kind of institution did you find?
It was a straight macro international institution, much easier for me to understand than the World Bank has been. Because the World Bank is doing all kinds of different things. The mandate of the IMF is narrower. Now, you asked about women. Around that time, the share of women at the IMF was around 15%. 15, yes. And the systematic efforts to increase that share came much later. And I had excellent memories of the early years at the IMF. I was in the research department. Guillermo Calvo, who has been a longtime mentor for me, he was a professor of mine at Columbia University, and he was senior advisor in the research department and worked a lot with me and some of the other younger, the younger staff that had joined, people like Enrique Mendoza, Carlos Vey, were part of my cohort, Jose de Gregorio, so working with Guillermo and also doing country work, because I got seconded.
Which countries did you?
Panama.
Panama.
It was my first IMF mission. And, it's actually, I know if I bore you, but it's a brief story. My first IMF mission was in Panama, and this was a time where the U.S. is trying to get Noriega out of the country. So there had been a lot of civil unrest. This is just before the Marines turned up, and when I got there, my suitcase was shipped elsewhere, so I got there, in jeans and espadrilles and no suitcase, and there had been a widespread closure because of looting and so on of stores. So I'm saying this because my first meeting with the Panamanian authorities, the IMF team, I had asked, some of the women at the central bank, look, everything's closed. Where can I buy clothes? And I turned up to the first meeting with the authorities with a muumuu dress that was, like a tent and espadrilles. The rest of the IMF mission could actually not look at me for fear of cracking up. I'm not making this up. And
maybe it helped relations.
No, nobody remembers what I said in that meeting, but I'm sure they remember what I wore.
I hope that's in an archive somewhere, the photo.
God forbid. But it was, it's a good mix of being able to do research and also get involved in the work of the institution. Yeah. So you've approached economics always with an international view of, the field and the kinds of questions and problems that you want to tackle. And so are your dreams of what, international economics might be fulfilled when you get to the IMF? Do you find it's doing the work that you want to be doing, or are there gaps that you think need filling? So, when I joined the IMF, just as when I had joined Wall Street, I thought I would probably have a long-term career at the IMF. I certainly found the work interesting. But as time went by, and I spent a good bit of the time in research, and that part really came alive. And so I went back to full circle. I wanted to end up in academia as I did, So after some years at the IMF, I went to the University of Maryland. And since that time, I've always sort of had one foot, based in academia, but with one foot in policy institutions. But also, I've never lost my connection with financial markets. I love talking to financial market participants. I do a lot of that.
But are these worlds separate for you, or do they constantly sort of interact in your mind?
No, they interact in my mind, yeah.
Right. Influencing what you work on in academia.
Indeed.
And what you take from the academic work. I mean, I was going to ask you this later on, but I found very interesting that you've become interested in the long range, the longue durée history, if you like, of sovereign debt. So I've been working on the early 19th century myself and the invention of international finance, and there you are looking at Waterloo in one of your recent papers.
Yes, but that's been going on for a long, long time. That sort of pushing it back earlier and earlier. In some of my early work with Guillermo Calvo and Leo Lederman on international capital flows, we were focused on sort of the modern day of that day, and the reopening of capital markets for many developing countries. But sort of the question that arose was, these things are really long cycles. You have the biblical lean 7 years and the biblical 7 fat years, and so a lot of my work also with Graciela Kaminsky started to push further back, still in the realm of the post-war. And then years later, I think, when clearly the sparks to do work on really long horizons was, I had taken leave from University of Maryland to spend 2 years at the IMF when Ken Rogoff was chief economist there. I was his deputy director for the research department. And we did a paper called Debt Intolerance, which started to look at the advanced economies when they themselves were more like emerging markets.
Right. Okay, yeah.
And look at, the history of sovereign defaults going back to, 15th century Spain. And so that's the origins of the book, that really and so I definitely have big interest in sort of recurring patterns.
So it's the patterns, and that's what interested me, whether you thought history offered lessons or actually what you looked for were longer patterns,
yes,
or cycles,
yes,
of crisis.
I also, of course, very early on, very much took to the work of Kindleberger also, right, on crises, but the idea that a crisis, whether you're talking about a currency crash, a banking meltdown, a sovereign default, high or hyperinflation, that no two episodes are ever going to be identical. But if you look at these, there are shared similarities. So that kind of, it's kind of like detective work for me.
Right. Well, Johanna here is the history of crisis expert, so I might let her get a word in edgeways. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, but actually, just to come back on this, the variety of places where you've been working, and of course it is feeding your work, but I wonder a bit strategically, as a woman, the fact that you were on all fronts all the time, do you think it helps to accelerate your career, that the fact that you could be able to talk to economists in international organizations and in academia and in the financial sector?
I don't view my career as accelerated.
Okay.
Because I've actually had to live through it. So, I don't view my career as accelerated. I think early on there was some acceleration. Being chief economist early on was a big deal. Pretty rare. But I went through the IMF trajectory. The thing is, what does give one leverage is options. And options usually arise from a portfolio that's, diverse. that has an element, and by diverse I don't mean I'm a specialized person, but you know, that doing research, having the ability to go to an academic institution gives one leverage at the IMF or at the bank. In academia, being able to work in the financial industry or which pays comparatively more, also gives one leverage. So the answer to your question is the diversification has helped. But I would not really view beyond that initial spurt, I wouldn't view the rest of my career as accelerated.
Well, that's so interesting. So, I mean, perhaps if we move to the bit that it defines you now and the World Bank and the role you have there. Well, let's start with, when you said already that you're just coming to understand it in comparison with the IMF. So, what's your sense, when you took the job, what was your sense of the institution? Because it has kind of a mixed history. It's changed its, role in the world since its, establishment in 1944. So, did you come to it with any particular expectations of, an international organisation, the kinds of economics one could do there?
So, I had enough, contacts, colleagues that knew the institution to have, a good sense of the nature of the work. I think, the multiplicity and hybrid nature of its mandate, ever-expanding mandate, is something that is more difficult to get your arms around, And so I mean, for instance, just during my stay there, the institution's mandate to do climate work has escalated, dramatically. The mandate to do more on building resilience to the kinds of pandemic has escalated. And so, it's the IMF is heading in that direction, but it's still, big difference. So that, that was a dimension of the bank that you don't quite really appreciate until you're there. And I have to say, on a more mundane note, the fact that you can live from going from meeting to meeting was not, the very large number of meetings is I was not prepared for that.
But, well, welcome to academia in Florence. But anyway,
No, believe me.
I know,
believe me.
But you come in at a very high level, and do you feel that that you can have an influence over the agenda or how it operates?
So there are certain things that, yes, you can have an influence over the agenda. Concretely, a lot of the work, for example, and something that I've been very, very involved with, connected to debt issues, is the issue of debt transparency. A lot of the work that I had done before going to the World Bank with Christoph Trebisch and Sebastian Horn. Sebastian Horn has joined me at the bank. Was a lot on the hidden debt problem that many emerging markets, and mostly developing countries, mostly developing, middle to low and low income countries have. Huge borrowing from China, very poorly documented. This is a major surveillance issue. I mean, how could you talk about debt sustainability and do macroeconomic projections when you're only capturing a fragment of the actual debt? And also in financial markets, how can you price risk if you're not really playing with the full deck of cards? And so I feel I've had an impact on the debt transparency agenda within the department that I have run, is the team that produces the international debt statistics. So they've had a full-fledged effort to beef up reporting. Another area is choices of what the World Development Report focuses on. And last year's we focused on sort of issues relating to financial fragility in emerging markets, as not just on the sovereign side, but also on the private side, given the big decline in economic activity, the fact that recovery in most emerging markets has been very sluggish, especially relative to advanced economies. The next World Development Report is on cross-border migration, which obviously, given what's going on, is. So those are areas where you feel you can have, some influence, but one should never get carried away in thinking how much influence one has or does not have. A recurring sense of frustration shared by the president of the World Bank, by David Malpass, is the lack of progress in the international arena with moving to resolving debt crises for the low-income countries. The common framework, which was introduced by the G20 about a year and a half ago, has gone nowhere. And so, the World Bank and the IMF, by and large, are bystanders. These are ultimately decisions of the sovereigns that are in charge, the creditors. And so, it's you realize there's things you can help influence and other things that are.
So in a sense, there are different international spaces almost, some occupied by intergovernmental organisations like your own, and others by groupings that take no notice, or just the kind of national economies that aren't engaging.
Well, I mean, when it comes to, for example, moving forward in resolving debt crises, it's ultimately the creditor country. So, if China is the largest creditor, they are bigger than the Paris Club creditors combined, then the ball is in their court. So you realize there's certain things that you cannot, you try to influence, doesn't mean you don't work on it, write about it, but recognizing that ultimately that's not a decision that.
Do you think has that always been the case? Is that your sense that the World Bank and these international economic institutions have been bystanders, or that this is symptomatic of what some people argue is, the end of the international order that we have, of its declining relevance, and that, that something else is sitting on the horizon we haven't quite got to yet?
No, I didn't say there were bystanders in every dimension. I'd said in this particular dimension, they're not, they're not in a position to tell creditor countries what they should do. But certainly, both institutions really jumped to the occasion. They hopped to the occasion during COVID. I mean, you've seen a surge in lending and fast disbursement lending by the IMF, by the World Bank, by all the multilaterals during COVID. There is, right now in the context of what is looking more and more like the buildup to a food crisis in many developing countries, big spike in food prices. The World Bank is doing a lot to work with countries to, one of the concerns is that there's not a lot that you can do about food shortages in the very short run and food prices in the very short run. But a big concern is that this can spill over, meaning if the planting cycle doesn't start, if you don't have enough fertilizers, if fertilizers are too expensive, that this process is going to escalate. And so they're working right now specifically on that dimension with countries to enhance food supplies. So there's a lot where they're certainly not bystanders, that they're involved in the fray, but there are certain things that the big foot, big feet are the large countries, not just. It used to be the G7, but now it's the G7 and China.
I also noticed, in fact, I was looking that the World Bank is currently very engaged in the Ukraine question as well. And you said you've just come from a meeting regarding COVID and the pandemic. So the institution is trying to be very relevant, right? So
absolutely. I think, look, these institutions, both the IMF, with Christoph Trebesch in 2016, I did a paper for the Journal of Economic Perspectives on the first 70 years of the IMF. A historical perspective of the institution. And what I'm about to say of the IMF also applies to the bank, even though the paper was strictly about the IMF, but it's that these institutions adapt and morph to the changing needs.
Right.
And that's how they've survived. That's how they've stayed relevant. The World Bank, in its origins, right at the end of World War II, really sees the very first formalized development lending. Before that, last year, Sebastian Horn, Christoph Trebesch, and I finished. We're still not finished. We're still revising a paper on the history of official lending.
Right.
And this goes back to the early 1800s, in which lending, and we have all the documentation from legal, mostly cross-border lending was confined to disasters. Whether it was a war, even some cross-border lending during financial crises. Some during natural disasters, much less so, but certainly no systematic development lending. That only enters the picture when the IMF and the World Bank are created. Sure. So, but the host of countries that the bank was lending to back then was very different from who it lends to now. The IDA, International Development country sets, there are about 73 countries the bank is very engaged in. Most of those were not countries when the bank was not yet. And so it was lending to what are now a lot of middle income and upper middle income countries. Similarly, the IMF, in its early history, wasn't lending to the emerging markets of developing countries. It was lending to advanced economies that had balance of payments crises.
So has the kind of the objective, to do something about climate change, and at the same time, be a kind of a development lender, led to new ways of thinking about the kinds of projects it lends money for, or what it gets involved in?
Well, the kinds of projects, by definition, will have to expand, right? I mean, I think, speaking quite candidly, a big, hurdle to full-scale involvement of the bank on, say, climate finance is, the private sector wants guarantees. They want somebody to take first loss. And the bank hasn't yet embraced that view. So, it does involve coming up with new, adapting old instruments. World Bank guarantees are not new. They've been around for a while. But, new programs. Even during the COVID pandemic, when at the same time that we saw the Federal Reserve and the ECB, bring to bear a lot of new facilities to help the private sector. The IMF also and the World Bank, brought on board newer ways of financing that are faster. And so it's always evolving.
I mean, so just on that point, and I'll give Hannah a chance, then open up the floor as well to other people to ask questions. Just ask, so given that it is evolving and you can have a role in it, how would you like to see it evolve both internally and externally? Are there things that you'd like to see, apart from less meetings or fewer meetings? Is there a gender diversity problem in the World Bank still, or other kind of diversity problem?
These institutions have come a long way. They always have to be very mindful. So, I would say the problem has diminished in size. It's still viewed as a problem that, notwithstanding, very, very visible progress, there's some, areas where diversity is a challenge. And I'm not just talking about gender diversity, I'm also talking about racial and regional diversity.
Do you think, one of the questions that we ask in the project is whether, it makes a difference, or it has made a difference if, women economists were in these institutions, not on some essentialist basis, but there have been studies, for example, of Chapal in the 1980s and 90s that saw the hiring of women, more than one woman, so groups of women, and the effect that had on the kinds of research topics that Chapal sort of ventured into. Do you think that there is an argument for the fact that diversity influences the kinds of institution that the World Bank might become in terms of its agenda, as well as just how it operates on a day-to-day basis?
So by definition, diversity is likely to bring more diversity, right? I mean, because you're talking about more hybrid interests. It's really hard to say, look at these institutions and say, well, these things have evolved and changed because the gender balance has improved, or because the world has changed.
Right.
So it's hard to, I think what's important, an important role that having visible women in visible positions is also, I think, it feeds into early, young generations, where they don't just see men in certain roles. The Janet Yellen being, Fed chair was a big landmark, and so I do think it's important in that dimension.
And Carmen Reinhart at the World Bank.
I'm not the first.
Would you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. Because you were mentioning the evolution, obviously, of these organizations and the goal that they have to adapt to the world, but also because they dream of a world that they want to work for that doesn't exist yet. And I wonder a bit, even for yourself, the room you have to dream in these organizations. What are you working for the future world? More prosperity, stability? I don't know.
So look, I have a fairly dim view of the success. We don't observe the counterfactual, so we don't know whether things would be much, much worse. But and this is not new, and this is something that I've been vocal about, and if nothing else, I'm pretty frank on offering my opinions on that score. But the idea that which has become less and less prevalent, but if you look back to before 2015, the idea that emerging markets and developing countries were in this very good space, and that you had, up to that point, you had a combination of high growth, upgrades in credit ratings, reduced risk of any kind of crises, and that was the new normal. I was never convinced that was the new normal. And I think institutions like the IMF and the World Bank often tend to fall into that bandwagon because everyone wants to show a success. Very recently, I did a short blog, and I presented this in Oslo a few days ago, called the reversal problem, which is going backwards in development. A lot of countries, even before COVID, you had started to see definite backsliding along many of the dimensions of the development goals, right? We're going in the wrong direction, even before COVID. Now, COVID has really accelerated a lot of these development backtracking, whether we're talking about human capital and education, the closures of schools, and what that does to human development and therefore expected future productivity, and what per capita incomes being well off their peak, debt levels that are starting to look a lot like debt levels during the last debt crisis. This is not hypothetical, this is not conjecture. At the moment, about 60% of the low-income countries that were eligible for the DSSI, this is about 74 countries, are either at high risk of debt distress or in debt distress. So this is not. So there's been a lot of backsliding. So I don't. In terms of what are the institutions working for, where are the IMF works towards financial stability, economic stability. The World Bank is to reduce poverty. That's another area where we've seen backpedaling. 2020 marked the first increase in global poverty since 1998. doesn't mean that what you're striving for is not a good goal, but success is yet elusive.
Okay, well, we're trying to maintain our optimism.
Okay. Sorry about that.
So can we, I'd like to open the floor to questions from the audience, if anyone has any.
We have mics to distribute.
If you'd like to ask a question. It can be about any sort of topic, from sovereign debt to the World Bank. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. It was totally very interesting. So my name is Myriam Piguet. I'm a PhD student at the University of Geneva, and I study mainly the integration of women as international civil servants, both in the Secretariat of the League of Nations and of the United Nations. So obviously what you've been relating here made me think about many of the things that I went through in my thesis. And one of the questions that I was wondering about is whether you, when you started your career, did you question your position as a position where you felt that you were discriminated inside this international organization, or maybe in academia? Or did you feel that maybe in some way this posture that you had as one of the scarce women in this organization was different than in academia? So that would be my first question. And the second is, so many of the women that I study, of course, they represent another period of time, but they often complain that they always brought towards soft questions.
They what?
So they always brought towards soft questions such as genders, women's rights, this kind of questioning education. And I wonder if you ever felt that you were pushed into this direction, and if you did, whether you were able to how were you able to avoid these questions throughout your career?
So on the discrimination was, did I ever feel discriminated? The straight answer is yes, absolutely. But being also a rational individual, that means that one evaluates what, there's a signal extraction problem, right? That was it really discrimination, or was it something else, that you had a boss that wasn't particularly assertive in getting his people promoted? And so, but did I feel discriminated? Yes. And that was earlier. That was at the bank. Have I felt discriminated? No. The questions, and let me say the questions on gender and all these other things, David Malpass is as likely to get those questions as I am, because issues relating to gender, to education, a lot of the social dimensions are things that are really core at the bank. At conferences, I work in international finance, so the kinds of questions that I get are pretty, you know what I mean? That it isn't. Maybe there's, some sort of random question on, but it's hard for me to actually remember anything like that. It doesn't resonate.
Are there any other questions? There's one thing. Okay.
Maybe I'll stand up. My name is Costanza Herman, and I work here at the School of Transnational Governance as a research fellow, and I focus on inclusive leaderships in terms of gender and diversity and their effects on policy making. My question is kind of a bit of a follow-up, because as a political scientist, I've always wondered why the most authoritative indexes for gender equality worldwide are compiled by networks and forums like the World Economic Forum. I look at the Global Gender Gap Report, and it comes from there. And I have an explanation of mine, but I would like to listen to yours. And I also wonder that given that this data come from there, why don't we see a maybe bigger role of this kind of institutions and fora on explaining why gender equality is not only an issue of parity democracy / social justice, but an issue of better, let's say, life conditions for everybody. That's it. Thank you.
Well, I would like to, and this is something that I don't often do, I actually would like to put in an important plug for a lot of the work of the bank. The World Bank does a lot on gender stuff, on gender issues. Women, business, and the law, which is importantly, and it's a report that also needs improvement because it's focused on the de jure. So it's strictly de jure whether the laws are adhered to. But in women, business, and the law, it's really about, do legal status empower women to contribute to their respective economies as equals? That's sort of the premise, and there's quite a bit of research, not academic research, but research meaning into legal research, into legal systems, and it has been a catalyst to some of the changes, for instance, that we saw in Saudi Arabia not that long ago. It has, played that role. In the group at the bank also that does human resources, and that's the education under Mamta Murti. There's, a lot of gender work being done, and a lot of data. But I'm not sure that gets to your question, because I'm just focused on two areas where I think there is a lot of data, again, these are newer products. So, you look at I mentioned earlier, the international debt statistics. Well, that has a 50-year history. Women, business, and the law has less than a decade. So, it takes also a while for these things to also, I think, become part of knowledge in the public domain.
Okay, we have a question here. And then Emma, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Or Rosenboim, and I'm Jean Monnet Fellow here at the Robert Schuman Center. I'm a historian of political thought. And my question is about climate. So I was following on your last point and the kind of dim view. I wonder, given the urgency of many climate issues that we all know of, and particularly you referred to climate finance, whether you thought that, generally speaking, the strategy of the bank should be to insist more, to revolutionize the entire plan, or something else. So how should we move on? Thank you.
So, the climate work of the bank has stepped up dramatically in the last 2 years, even less than that. And there's two parts of it. In one, I think it's made really big strides, and the other one is still lagging. The one that is made big strides, I think, is a development of a new way of measuring country by country the state of the climate needs, we're identifying, what the current state is and charting a path of what needs to be done, which is given the heterogeneity, whether it's closing a coal plant or, moving some of the climate needs really also have to do with dealing with immediate climate change and the physical impacts of immediate climate change. So I would call that diagnostics. I think the bank has moved very far on diagnostics. I think the big challenge, and this is not just the bank, okay? This is every major government, and is how do you bring the private sector money in? How do you bring, because in this dim view of what is happening to development, you have developing countries that need finance. These are the very countries, many of them, that are already in debt distress or that don't have far to go before getting into debt distress. Their ability to finance anything, anything from current budgets to restoring education to something similar to what it was before the pandemic, let alone the changes that are needed to green the economy. That is all finance intensive. And it's not just the kind of finance that developing countries and emerging markets often attract, which is hot money. It's not about short money seeking a high coupon, chasing a high coupon yield. You need, and for that, it's hard to see that happening without a public and private partnership. And that's where I brought, I think, the big sticking point for the bank, and it will have to come to terms with it one way or another in terms of what role it's going to play. Is private sector wants guarantees. They want, yeah, we'll join if you take first loss. At the same time, the model, the economic model of the bank is one in which the bank can help and lend to countries and lend concessionally to countries if it maintains its AAA rating, okay? So that it can leverage, it can borrow comparatively cheaply through its AAA rating and then lend to sovereigns that have far from it. And the big fear, of course, is you start giving out guarantees and taking first losses in all these projects. And that model is going to be threatened. So in the end, this is going to have to be the big governments, the big donor countries saying, okay, time to rethink the model of the bank, time to rethink what we are giving support to the bank, because in that current model, whereas if the bank says, okay, we're going to break the mold, we're going to go out forcefully and provide the private sector with lots of guarantees, private sector money would come in. But the credit ratings of the bank would most likely suffer. And that, of course, is the mechanism through which the bank can fund its subsidized lending. So it's not this is a real core issue, what you're asking. So that's, and in the end, it's going to have to be the big donors, the G7, that have to and China, to make make a decision of how forceful do they want to be on providing climate finance to developing countries. Because the great irony, and I mentioned this, that the next WDR is on cross-border migration. And a lot of the expected future cross-border migration is climate-driven. Because in the Sahel and other parts, this is where, you're seeing the most rapid deterioration in conditions.
I have a follow-up question on this, and before, sorry for interrupting the audience, but it seems like there is this kind of paradox for an international organizations that has a planetary vision, and the fact that nations are still the scale and the interlocutors, and even for us in academia, we try to escape a bit this, what we call now this methodological nationalism, but it is extremely hard to think outside of the nation when all the solutions could not be limited by national borders. And we see that international organizations dialogue a lot with business organizations, for example, and obviously with NGOs, but it's a dialogue. It's not the same kind of relation that the World Bank has with governments, for example. Is it something that we can imagine for the future, to have a more structured collaboration between the World Bank and non-governmental organizations that are also businesses?
What I'm going to say is really crass, but it's all about money. It's all about money. The whole principle of development outcomes, like climate outcomes for countries that have limited to no resources or very limited, it's in the end going to be, do the wealthy countries want to pay the tab? And that applies for a lot of things, right? It applies certainly for climate finance is one huge example, but it's not only that. I mean, I won't name names of what countries there are, but when executive directors at the bank from advanced economies, when the issue of debt forgiveness is brought up, is, well, we did HIPC already. HIPC was the highly indebted poorest country initiative. We already wrote those debt off. You're not surely suggesting that we do that again. So in the end, it's very importantly about the willingness to allocate. And the advanced economies are preoccupied with their own issues. China right now is also preoccupied with its own issues. And you mentioned my piece on sovereign bonds as Waterloo. Well, a key takeaway from that is, when we document all the haircuts and debt restructurings over time, is debt restructuring take a really long time to sort out. But that's because you typically have the same clash between debtors and creditors. Creditors want to be repaid, and debtors want debt forgiveness. So, it's all about money. And so I think the dialogue is a reflection of that. And you can try to disguise it. And, I mentioned earlier that the common framework has gotten nowhere. It will get nowhere until the creditors really get serious, whether they want to contemplate debt forgiveness, debt write-offs.
Well, we have a debt expert in the audience who wanted to ask a question. Maybe is it related to that, Adriana? So if you bring the microphone to Adriana just here.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. I'm Adriana Calcaño. I work on, in general, CEPAL and institutions, international institutions. So I had a kind of down-to-earth question, since we have your experience as working in the IMF, in the World Bank as well. I was wondering So is there a strong link generally between these two institutions, and is there a strong cooperation? So whenever it is about debt restructuring, or even about the problem that you said at the beginning, the hidden debt problem. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, is there a cooperation between the two institutions to study that, and also maybe with the countries that have these debt problems? Are there cooperations? Do they have specialized researchers or even consultants? So thank you.
So that's an excellent question, and it's a really charged one, and it's also different things. So, look, as far as the G20 and the powers that be, the G7, and whether they like it or not, the IMF and the World Bank are supposed to sing the same songs, you know, in terms of collaboration, in terms of, you know, working not across purposes, but towards, you know. Now, there are, in the context that you asked, certain key pieces to that collaboration. One of them is the LIC DSA, the Low Income Debt Sustainability Analysis, which is a joint product of the IMF and the World Bank. The comparable debt sustainability analysis for middle income economies is an IMF product. The World Bank is only the low income one is. But when I mean low income, I don't mean the 25 countries, 26 countries that are in the low income. I mean middle to low also, you know, there's like 74 countries that. So that's formal, that's a formal process. That's collaborative. Collaborative, but not always easy. You know, in that very often there's divergent views, as you might expect, on projections for the economy. That importantly, that is huge in shaping, you know, a chronic complaint is the projections are so optimistic that you can make any debt look sustainable, okay? In a nutshell, or you can assume fiscal programs are so well done and aggressive that is sustainable. So there's, on the hidden debt, there's a lot of also stuff ad hoc collaboration, like you have in academia, that two people that are in different institutions join up. You know, I work a lot, have discussions with some unfolding work in the African department of the IMF. That's you know, they're revisiting all the hidden debt problems, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa. But that also comes about because, you know, two people sat down that were interested in a similar, so that part of it is more ad hoc, okay? The LIC DSA is not, that's systematic. Very often, and I wasn't being facetious when I said the G7 and the stakeholders of both institutions mandate that they work together, and this is reflected in very often calls for, say, joint board papers on. One of the examples on the debt front is, and this has been, you know, a series of board papers that cover a range of issues on facilities, transparency, but these are reporting regularly to both boards, the IMF board and the World Bank board. and for the life of me, the name of that series of papers is escaping me, but it's a regular board paper series. So, you know, another area where the collaboration is critical, and that comes out also in the DSA, is funding, right? So if the IMF engages in a program with Chad, and, you know, it has to know what kind of financing Chad is going to get from the World Bank to have a, so you know, it sounds trivial, but that's actually really critical. And it's really critical also when you're talking about debt restructuring, you know. Is the debt restructuring envelope going to be this or this? And that depends on, you know, how much financing is available versus how much debt reduction will be needed.
So Carmen, we have quite a few more questions. So I think what we might do is take them together, and then you get a chance to answer in any way you like. And because there are drinks waiting out there, and you've really earned them. All of you have earned them. So if we take we've got Interstitial, but also just here as well. So there's 4. Yeah. So you can start. Oh, you've got one too, Catherine. So Troy, yeah, he's next. Okay.
I'll try to be quick. Yeah, I couldn't quite believe my ears, but you were saying that you got into economics because of a Marxist professor. Was that correct? Or
Because of what?
a Marxist professor?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I
So
do.
if you could speak more about that and perhaps your opinion on heterodox economics in general, I'd be
Okay.
interested to hear that.
Thank you. I want to kind of come back to your career. So you started out in the IMF as a research economist, went into academia, and then had management positions both in research in the IMF and in the World Bank. Now there is this debate whether how independent can research be in the international organization? Should it actually be there? I mean, one of your predecessors, your predecessor, was very strong saying no, there should not be a research department in the World Bank at all. There should maybe be just a data collection department, that's it. Now, given your own experience, and of course I know that you probably have a biased view because you are the head of research at the World Bank, but what is your view? What are your arguments for yes, there should be a research department in the international organization, and it can to a certain extent maybe be independent?
Sorry, so actually my question was slightly preempted by Troy already, but I wanted to sort of add, I'm a first-year PhD researcher in history, and I thought that it was really interesting when you were sort of talking about, you know, your first PhD interest, which Glenda asked you about, and you said, you know, more interest in sort of monetary policy and so on. And one thing that I find starting out in my own kind of research journey is that even though as an historian I would try to resist, you know, being too much influenced by current debates and ideas and so on, of course I am. And I was kind of wondering in that period of time when you were at Columbia University, what the debates were. You started off with sort of this Marxist historian and economist, that was teaching you. But obviously we have the sort of Chicago School economic thinkers at that time and monetarism and so on. And I would just be interested to hear what were the debates going around in the PhD faculties and history faculties and economics faculties at that point, and how prevailing were, for example, the Chicago School economic thinkers at that time.
Thank you. Hi. My name is Michele Lacevic, University of Bologna, and it was refreshing actually to hear that one of the entry doors for you to the economics profession was also the history of economic thought, which is something that we don't often hear. And I wanted to follow up on the question about the collaboration with the IMF. I was wondering whether there is, you mentioned the fact that there is of course cooperation and at times divergences, but if you experience also divergences on issues on which institution actually owns specific issues on the agenda, because in the history of the relationship between the two organizations there has been a lot of discussion about this. Thank you.
And just behind you, Michael, there's one more. That's the last one. Yeah.
Hi, George Papakonstantinou, professor at School of Transnational Governance, policymaker in a previous life during the Greek crisis. I kind of hesitate to ask this question because it's the last one. So, but I'm prompted by your dim view, which is a realistic view. And we find ourselves with historically high debt levels post-COVID in the middle of a war that will have a absolutely huge reconstruction cost, with food prices going up everywhere and therefore needs across the board for higher deficit and debt levels. And with the climate perhaps getting an even bigger push to wean ourselves away from sort of dependence on oil and gas. And with a very fragmented financial system, which may become even more so given the way we've weaponized the dollar and the euro in the current conflict. So because it's not a different situation, like this time is not different, so what gives? It seems that we're entering an absolutely perfect storm here. What is it that we can do to avoid the next financial crisis?
Okay, these are big questions. So you can start with the past and go into the future.
So, okay, very briefly on my Marxist professor. He used as a supplementary, this is an introductory course, he used Dowd's The Twisted Dream, which was importantly a book about market failures. And I don't know, I found that things that don't work had a great amount of interest. So it was a combination of those lectures and The Twisted Dream and the market failures, and here's a lot of stuff that isn't working that I think was you know, before because that's a big question. I'm like a real pragmatist. I've never really gotten. I can't say, I'm monetarist, neo-Keynesian, Austrian school. I'm very pragmatic. That's my thing. I'm not. The kind of labeling and just doesn't really appeal to me. I don't know if that fully answers your, but the big question you pose, I do think that there is a role for research in the multilaterals, because not always, but quite often, some of that research also dovetails into the work of the institution in a way that academia doesn't always provide. So I think there is a role that, because it tends to be on the whole, have more of a policy tilt in some of the issues that are germane to the institutions. I dealt with the issue of the cleanup of doing business. So I can tell you the need for independent. And that has to be and I don't think, by the way, just doing data solves the problem of independence, because data manipulation you know, whether you write it up on a paper or whether the data remains there for others to use, if it's been manipulated, it's useless. And so you know, and I think data has been a public good but the issue of independence is very tough. It's very, I mean, completely essential, but tough in the sense that this cannot be achieved by a single person, that this has to be institutionalized. You know, that a lot of transparency will help. Putting stuff out in the public domain, you know, that not just the final product, which was the case in doing business, but all the granular stuff that went into it, because it makes it harder. The more you tie, in the end, if senior management weighs in, or if big donor countries weigh in, it's always going to be dangerous. Always. And you can never downplay that danger. But I think saying research and data collection don't belong in these institutions is draconian, you know, you're literally throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That's my view. And I've dealt with the cleanup dimension of it very firsthand. You know, on the issue of turf battles between the bank, they're alive and well. The turf battles are alive and well. I think, given their backgrounds, the World Bank president, David Malpass, would prefer to be running the fund, and Kristalina would prefer to be running the bank. I mean, this is just their backgrounds. That you look at their background, and one is you know, development economist, you know, the other was a macro, you know, and so but in the end, this is why I keep talking about the shareholders. Those institutions were, you know, created with different mandates by the shareholders. And that, you know, so whenever, from time to time, conditions get really, there is intervention from, you know, messaging, very strong messaging from the shareholders that, you know, stick to your role and you know, work together, because that was and at some basic level there is, you know, realization of that. I mean, the bank is not equipped to do you know, balance of payment support, and the fund, not yet, it may be at some point, but the fund can't do the scale and complexity of bank development lending, which is, you know, got a 30-year maturity, and it's highly concessional, and it, you know, they're different models, but and the peacekeepers there, if you will, are the shareholders. On the last question, which I was hoping I wouldn't get, so what gives? Look, a financial crisis, I don't think that a financial crisis, say a la Lehman Brothers, is in the offing, okay? But we are already having a different kind of, we're having an inflation crisis that we haven't seen in more than 4 decades. And that's one of the things that has given. You know, we've had, after the global financial crisis, the largest central banks, the Fed, the ECB, the BOJ, they all decided we did massive accommodation, quantitative easing, exceptionally low interest rates for exceptionally long time, and we didn't get inflationary consequences. Enter COVID, we did the same on an even bigger scale, because the expectation was that, well, we did it before without adverse consequences and inflation, and now we have a lot of inflation. And a big difference in that calculus, I'm oversimplifying, but not by much, is we didn't have supply shocks. I mean, global financial crisis was importantly about, over leveraging, aggregate demand falling as, firms and banks needed to delever. Now we have a lot of supply shocks, so we're kind of in a 1970s world in a way that, the term stagflation was very popular, towards the tail end of my academic training. There was the early 80s, late 70s was, and I think we're at much higher risk of being in a high inflation, low growth environment than we have been in decades. And I think a complication is that exiting from low interest rates, is a delicate, and I've been writing about this and talking about this for some time. When I alluded to earlier in my remarks, when Paul Volcker raised interest rates by 600 basis points, public sector debt wasn't anywhere near what it is today in pretty much, in the US and in advanced economies. And private sector debt wasn't either. So I think central banks also are more constrained, which, I think this, and I'm ending on a really grim note, but your question wasn't exactly uplifting either. I think this stagflationary risks are going to be with us for some time. Ultimately, high inflation does bring down debt, ultimately, but it's a very inelegant way of doing it also because inflation is very regressionary, very regressive across countries and within country. When it comes to the U.S., I think it's very difficult to see the U.S. not introducing higher taxes at some point, as politically unfeasible as it seems at the moment. Uplifting, but...
Okay, well, thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you for answering all those questions. We're really grateful for your time this evening. We now have drinks in the other room, and please feel free to take them onto the veranda. It will be cooler than in here. Thank you again, and I hope this was an interesting introduction to life at the EUI.
Indeed.
Thank you for your time, and thank you all for your questions. Terrific.